I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. Major Western measures to limit Russia's oil profits over its war in Ukraine have taken effect. They bring uncertainty about how much crude could be lost to the world and whether they will unleash the hoped for hit to the Russian economy, which has held up better than many expected under sanctions. The European Union on Monday banned most Russian oil, and Canada and other members of the Group of Seven democracies imposed a price cap of $60 US per barrel on Russian exports to other countries. Well, with us now to discuss the situation is Dr. Heather Exner-Pirot, energy expert and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Doctor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So let's start with this EU ban first. What does this mean for Europe amid its energy crisis? And overall, what does this mean for Russia?
So the original ban was put in place a few months ago and is just taking effect, on December 5th. So they've had time to adjust, and it's a very careful compromise of trying to do maximum harm to Russia and minimum harm to Europe. The natural gas market is very different from the oil gas market. The oil is much more fungible. You can get it from more delivers. They're importing it anyways. And so I think they've tried to do as careful a job as they can to maintain their energy security supply of oil, especially given all the other constraints they're facing on energy, while trying to do, again, the maximum harm to Russia.
And in terms of this G7 price cap of $60 per barrel, how much of an impact do you expect this move to have on Russia's overall profits?
Right. So again, while the EU has mostly prohibited its import of Russian oil, the price cap applies to other countries. And so things like using insurance, European shipping companies to apply this ban on others so that China or India, if they want to continue to import Russian oil, and they do, to try to at least limit the profit that Russia is going to make on it. So there's wide ranging, kind of debate as to what kind of effect this will have on Russia. So far, the sanctions haven't had quite the economic bite that I think people hoped. Hasn't limited their their oil revenues as much as we thought. But again, a lot of these things are only coming into hand right now. So I think we will see to what extent it is. They promise to review it every 2 months and can adjust it from there. So it's still a bit of a wait and see.
Now, from your own expert opinion, what do you think what kind of impact would these measures have on Russia's war in Ukraine?
This is this is where it gets very complicated, that we absolutely need Russian oil, that we have not been investing enough into fossil fuels, into oil and gas to meet current demand. If China did not have COVID zero policies, we would be seeing oil probably at $120, $150 a barrel, because China is still locked down and still has kind of a reduced economic growth. There's been some relief. And so there's much reluctance to reduce Russian production totally, but trying to reduce the amount of money they're making off of it. And so this is the fine balance that has been reached. There are no perfect solutions in this. Russia itself is saying that it will not affect its ability to fund the war. And certainly in Eastern Europe, there's a sense that this isn't doing enough. But I think the United States, other big countries have in mind that we do not want a compound energy crisis. We don't want to harm ourselves more than we harm Russia.
Seems to be a fine line indeed. Now, Doctor, we mentioned that Russia is rerouting European shipments to countries like India, China, and Turkey, especially at discounted prices. So do you think these Western measures will likely be blunted?
I think for months, Russia and other enablers, maybe we will call them, have been creating a shadow fleet to take what is Russian oil and make it look like it's somewhere else. I've heard, for example, that Malaysia, its production has gone up. Its shipments are higher than its production has ever been. So there are all these ways that people are going to circumvent it. It still makes it complicated. It still makes it risky. It still, adds another layer of difficulty and complexity to Russia. And certainly, in the short term, we can debate the effect, but in the medium term, this has an effect on Russia's industry and on their economy for sure.
And what other moves do you expect G7 members and the EU to be considering amid Russia's war in Ukraine, ma'am? Just about 45 seconds left here.
The hardest, again, the sanctions are really only taking into effect now. The ones that we're going to start to feel the most impact is the things on like importing, equipment and supplies to repair, LNG trains, for example, which Russia can't do itself. And so we're going to see some of those supply chain constraints really start to impact the Russian oil industry in the coming months.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Exner-Pirot, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, stay with us. After the break, we're going to be taking a look at what to expect with food prices in 2023 as we unpack Canada's latest food price report. Our interview with Samantha Taylor from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University is up next. So stay tuned. Forum Daily will be right back. An average family of four can expect to fork out nearly $16,300 for groceries next year. Now, that would be nearly $1,100 more than this year's average spend. Canada's latest food price report says food inflation is here to stay, at least for the first half of next year. The report predicts that food prices will rise between 5 and 7% next year before easing back. Food bank use in Canada also reached a record high this year and is expected to continue to grow in 2023. Well, joining us now to unpack the report is Ms. Samantha Taylor with the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Ms. Taylor, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you again for having me again, Nima.
So what are the main takeaways that Canadians need to know from this report?
For sure. So I wish I was bringing a little bit better news, but right now what we hope that Canadians know is just to be prepared that while they are feeling the crunch with housing, with utilities, and with the economic slowdown, this crunch is likely to continue well into 2023.
Unwelcome news indeed, Ms. Taylor. Now, where will we see these price increases the most in terms of groceries?
Well, unfortunately, it's going to be pretty steady across the board. So we're going to be seeing them in dairy, we're going to be seeing it in meats, we're going to be seeing it in others, so kind of the middle of the store. And we're going to see it the most with vegetables at 6 to 8%.
Making it harder to eat healthier, it seems. Now, what are the main reasons driving these cost increases across the board here?
For sure. So it's going to be similar factors to what we've already seen with our 10.3% food inflation in 2022. So the impacts of the war in Ukraine, the tail end of the COVID-19 impact to the supply chain, high oil prices, continued global tensions, as well as labor shortages.
Now, are these price increases equal across the country, or are prices differing in some regions or provinces?
So they're relatively the same or similar across all provinces, with the exception of Quebec and Newfoundland, because they had uncharacteristically high price increases in 2022. They're unlikely to see the same magnitude of increase because they kind of had a bigger hit, and it's unlikely that those provinces will see the same relative hit year over year. But it's still going to be, towards that 5 to 7%, just perhaps slightly less than the other provinces.
And what about the restaurant industry? How do you expect these price increases to impact that sector?
So we're expecting it to be very similar at 4 to 6%, keeping in mind that restaurant prices have also increased rather significantly in 2022.
All right, Ms. Taylor. Now, in a previous interview, we were speaking about greedflation, which is essentially price gouging by the grocery sector in particular right now. We know there's a parliamentary investigation looking into this, a Competition Bureau study into the grocery store prices. What do you expect from these?
Well, I'm slightly more optimistic than the last time we spoke. In fact, right now, my colleague Sylvain Charlebois is testifying at the House of Commons, the Standing Committee for Agriculture, and really going to be testifying on our report as part of that. And so we're very optimistic because Canadians are being heard, their concerns are being heard at the highest levels. And the Competition Bureau has agreed to look end to end at the supply chain for why prices are going up in the grocery store. As well as I caught on the news a little while back after their Q3 earnings report, Loblaw said that they anticipate inflation to start easing. To me, perhaps that might be them signaling that, hey, we understand our price freeze on our no name is going to wrap up on January 31st. Well, perhaps, they might consider extending it if they are looking optimistically into the future. So, all in all, lots of positive indications. However, these things take time from a parliamentary and competition bureau standpoint. So I'm optimistic, although it won't be immediate.
Good to hear some positive news amid all of this. Now, Ms. Taylor, it looks like we've got about a minute left here, but what can consumers do to adapt to these higher prices? Any tips or guidance that you would have for us?
I teach cost management at Dalhousie, and when we really talk to corporations, we talk about the price you pay as well as the volume or the amounts that you use. So I would say the same advice holds true to consumers. And even further to that, get excited about something that will, save prices at the grocery store. So if you like apps, if you like coupon clipping, if you like shopping the sales, do that. If you want to reduce your food waste, if you want to cook large meals and freeze them, if you want to, be really diligent about reducing food waste by identifying, vegetables or fruit that might be turning, freezing them and locking in those nutrients and reducing your food waste. So my advice is find something that you can get excited about, because those small incremental impacts will have a large impact to your pocketbook.
Some very helpful advice there, Ms. Taylor. Thank you again for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our interview with the David Suzuki Foundation up next. Work is underway in Montreal today and for the next 2 weeks on ways to save the planet. This comes as the COP15 Global Biodiversity Conference looks to secure a plan to protect 30% of the Earth's land and water. Negotiators from nearly 200 countries are being asked to hammer out an agreement to begin to restore damaged ecosystems and halt further losses by 2030. Nature itself can help to prevent devastating losses due to climate change. It can absorb carbon dioxide that is contributing to global warming and reduce the effects of extreme weather. Aaron Jacob of the Nature Conservancy of Canada says the need for the 30% target is well supported by 50 years of scientific research. Well, with us now to discuss the conference and its goals is Mr. Jay Richlin, Nature Director and Director General for Western Canada at the David Suzuki Foundation. Mr. Richlin, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So as we said, the goal of this conference is to ratify an agreement to preserve 30% of the world's land and water. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that would look like?
Sure. Well, I really want to start out by emphasizing that the global biodiversity framework is much more than that. The protection of 30% of ocean and terrestrial land ecosystems is incredibly important, but it's a baseline from which we need to work to restore other ecosystems and to manage the way humans act in the areas that aren't protected as well. And those are really big parts of this conference. What it would look like is areas that are highly protected from industrial extraction. So no, industrial forestry or mining or really destructive fisheries in those areas. They would allow traditional uses for Indigenous people in many cases, and that's one of the big things being worked on now. And then we would have a system of ecosystem-based management outside the protected areas that meant that we weren't just running down our nature bank account, if you will, outside the protected areas and pretending that we were doing okay just by having 30% protected. That won't be enough. It's incredibly important, but it won't be enough by itself.
Sounds like a lot of initiatives to consider here. Now, we know the G7 has already agreed to this 30% target. So how likely are we to see a global consensus at this conference?
I think we have a good chance. I think the wealthy nations need to agree to support the developing world or the global south, however you want to term it, because their ability to get the things that they need to survive will potentially be limited by putting areas under protection. And they deserve to have some financial support to make that possible for their societies during a transition period to a different kind of economy that's not completely based on heavy extraction and consumption.
You also mentioned the Nature Conservancy of Canada says this 30% target is backed by 50 years of science. Can you tell us a little bit more about the scientific proof behind this 30% target?
Well, the science definitely shows that where we have areas with limited human industrial scale intervention, those areas provide clean air, clean water, food resources, pollination resources. I mean, we are all nature. We need nature to survive. So creating some spaces where the natural world is not completely under threat allows it to adapt to climate change, allows it to continue to have healthy areas where populations can grow and thrive, and humans then can still make their living and meet their needs by acting well in the other areas outside of that.
All right, Mr. Richlin, a little over a minute left here, but in recent news, we know the PM has announced $800 million to fund Indigenous-led conservation projects across the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about what we know so far about this initiative?
I think it's an incredible announcement. It's new to many of us today. We have confirmed that the 800 million is new money from the federal government. They're looking for matching funds from other parts of civil society and from private sector. But the nations are going to have a lot of say in how this looks going forward. So I think a lot of the details are going to come from the Indigenous communities themselves. But I can say that we think this is a very positive sign.
And is there anything that you're keeping your eyes on as this conference continues?
Yeah, absolutely. The way we work outside that 30% protected area is imperative to get that right. We need halting nature loss and reversing it to be in the commitments. And we need to deal with things like plastics, pesticides, and pollution, as well as just cutting down nature. And we've got to remember that the ocean is also part of the natural world. So land and ocean need the protection.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Mr. Richland, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
After the break, we turn to gender-based violence in Canada as the International 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign continues. Women and Gender Equality Canada launched its own national campaign theme called It's Not Just, highlighting the issue of gender-based violence and how society can dismiss behavior associated with it. On the heels of the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, advocates want to continue the conversation in hopes of ending the issue in Canada. Today is also day 13 of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, an annual international campaign which encourages people to help prevent and end all forms of gender-based violence. The campaign is set to end on December 10th, Human Rights Day. This month, Women and Gender Equality Canada launched its own national campaign theme, It's Not Just, which highlights both the issue of gender-based violence and how society can dismiss and minimize behavior or beliefs associated with it. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this and how Canadians can help end gender-based violence is Dr. Erin Whitmore, Executive Director at the Ending Violence Association of Canada. Dr. Whitmore, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me.
So what is the latest data we have on the current state of gender-based violence in Canada?
We know that gender-based violence continues to be a significant public health and human rights crisis in Canada. For example, we know 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical and sexual violence, and those numbers hold true in Canada. We certainly saw during the pandemic that rates of gender-based violence increased, and also the severity of that violence increased. And we know that there is always an increasing demand for access to services to support those who have experienced violence. I think, though, that the numbers only give us part of the picture, and that we really want to also recognize the significant impacts that gender-based violence holds for those who do experience these types of violence, these forms of violence.
On that note, can you tell us a little bit more about these significant impacts due to gender-based violence?
Sure. Well, gender-based violence can take many different forms. Often we hear about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, about sexual assault, but we also want to be aware of emotional or psychological abuse, financial abuse, technology, facilitated abuse. And I think it's important to remember that the impacts of that violence don't necessarily end when the violence itself stops, that often survivors of violence face many challenges in accessing services. There can be challenges in terms of mental health, in terms of their ability to continue to go to school or go to work, impacts in terms of their relationships. And violence continues to really limit and interrupt, the hopes and dreams that women and others who experience violence hold for themselves.
And it's so important to highlight, as you said, that gender-based violence comes in so many forms, not necessarily very obvious forms. Now, in terms of Canada's national theme, It's Not Just. Now, that's actually shedding light on how society can sometimes dismiss or minimize such gender-based violence, which can sometimes be in subtle ways. So can you tell us a little bit more about how this happens?
Yeah, that's so true. And I think that, one of the challenges, of course, is that gender-based violence often can be seen as something that happens between two individuals and is a private matter that, doesn't need to be discussed more broadly. But of course, we know that we have to have a conversation and talk about this violence if we want to make a difference. I think that also, it can be really challenging to talk about these experiences if you yourself are experiencing violence. Often it can be difficult to know who to talk to. It may be difficult to find somewhere to turn to that you feel is a safe place. Often someone who is using violence also tries to isolate someone, to silence them, and to make it really difficult to make that violence visible. So all of those can contribute to us not fully recognizing the extent of this problem. That being said, there is a lot of evidence that shows the extent of the problem of gender-based violence, and we really need to stop pretending that this isn't as big an issue as it is, and that it really requires action on the part of all Canadians if we really want to make a difference.
Some very important points to consider, especially leading up to Human Rights Day. As we know, women's rights are human rights. Dr. Whitmore, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media pages. Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter are available. You can also watch all of our news and commentary programming on the News Forum YouTube channel. Thanks for joining us again on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada. Have a great weekend.